On December 14th, 1991, mere days before the Soviet flag was lowered for the final time, a monumental party took place at Moscow's Space Pavilion Museum. Surrounded by rockets and satellites that represented the greatest prides of Soviet achievement, thousands of Moscow residents experienced the sensory overload of a rave for the very first time. The mood was one of overwhelming catharsis. There was the literal freedom to move and dance wildly after generations of discouragement. There was the optimism of a future where stores would be fully stocked, where politics would be secondary to passions and desires. Of course, these dreams did not happen. The 90s would be one of the most difficult decades in Russia, where life expectancy fell 8 years, and organized crime and hyperinflation simply replaced the pains of Soviet oppression. For some, like BBC filmmaker Adam Curtis, the Gagarin Party was the perfect metaphor for Russia's decline. Thousands of untamed partygoers dancing quite literally on the proudest monuments of a fallen empire. Like the Monsters of Rock concert 3 months earlier, but with far more dramatic symbolism. Regardless of how one perceives it today, the Gagarin Party was clearly a major musical event, and one that had some pretty wild music. So let's dive in. So if your first reaction to hearing the word rave is to imagine empty-headed trust fund kids in an orgy of indulgence, we need to challenge that preconception. Raves grew out of the same underground do-it-yourself culture as punk or early hip-hop. The genesis of the Gagarin Party was these two men, brothers Alexei and Andrei Haas, bohemian 20-somethings who were fixtures in Leningrad's underground music scene, but not really sure what to do with their lives. Like many Soviet cities at this time, Leningrad, soon to be renamed St. Petersburg, was completely broke and unable to maintain many of its historic buildings. Great big structures on the canals in the city center were completely abandoned, like this one at 145 Fontanka. In other words, they were the perfect spaces for artists like Alexei and Andrei to move into. For a bottle of vodka, they hired men on the street to demolish decaying walls. They restored the heating and utilities. And gradually, over the next year, the apartment began to take shape. It became a gathering place for artists, musicians, fashion designers, intellectuals, and weirdos of all kinds. But above all, it became a dance club.
Rock the house, y'all.
Включаете телевизор, даже там какие-нибудь убогие ленинградские программы или центральное телевидение, там сплошной рок-н-ролл, там сплошные безмозглые идиоты, корячащиеся с электрогитарами, поющие непонятно о чем, то есть...
Indeed, just as in other European cities, a new type of music was taking hold. Chicago house and Belgian new beat were replacing, or at least complementing, the hollowed status that punk and new wave once held. The fall of the Iron Curtain brought artsy 20-somethings from Western Europe seeking adventure, and some brought turntables with crates of records. DJ Joachim Garou from France recalled the first time he attended a Leningrad party. He was confused why so many car wheels were stacked up in the hallway, to which somebody casually explained, "Oh, when you park your car here, you take the wheels off so nobody steals them." Crime was an issue that would plague the Haas brothers' attempts to expand their club into larger spaces. They hosted several shows at Leningrad's planetarium, but these attracted the attention of gopniks, who would harass and intimidate attendees. The Haas brothers were also facing the threat of eviction by a seafood company who was purchasing the building. They knew they needed to do something different if they were going to stay afloat. And that's when friends Ivan Salmaksov and Zhenya Bierman stepped in with an idea. Let's set up a party in Moscow, they said. It's bigger, it's wealthier, we can hide from the mobsters, and we can bring back some money. The Haas brothers reluctantly agreed, bracing themselves for what would come next. But first, a word about our sponsor, NordVPN. So I'm gonna level with you guys. Having a VPN for internet research is great. Just a few weeks ago when working on this video, I had this happen. But a few clicks later, and I was through. And that's not to mention the added security and peace of mind. I actually became a NordVPN user before they approached me about sponsoring this video, because I liked their reliability and price. For a limited time, you can head to nordvpn.com/bansplaining to get a 2-year plan at a big discount, plus 4 additional months free. Even more, it's all backed up with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So once again, that's nordvpn.com/bansplaining. Or click the link in the description. While you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe. Okay, back to the story.
Даже по сравнению с западными танцинками, павильон «Космос» — уникальное место, так как полностью передает ощущение от этой музыки космоса, ощущение безграничного пространства, космической энергетики и неземной жизни.
The Moscow Space, or Cosmos Pavilion, was built way back in 1938. At that time, space travel was only a dream, and the purpose of the building was to showcase the mechanization of agriculture. The kids loved it. The pavilion was one of many at the VDNH, a massive park that celebrated the country's achievements. In 1957, the USSR sent the first satellite into space. A few years later, they sent the first cosmonaut. As the space race became a more and more important battleground of the Cold War, the pavilion was repurposed. It was filled with replica satellites, space shuttles, and rockets, hung from the ceiling pylons, communicating majesty, grandeur, and progress. But by the 1990s, everything had changed once again. With the switch to capitalism, museums had to figure out how to make themselves profitable. When the 2 Leningrad yuppies showed up, offering to rent the pavilion for a space-themed party, the decision was a no-brainer. $10,000 they requested, which Ivan and Zhenya readily accepted. Getting their hands on that much money was another matter. $10,000 was a lot of money at that time. $5,000 could buy you an apartment in Moscow. But the 4 men simply went downstairs to the company who was taking over the building. They told them that they'd turn a $10,000 investment into 20. And this was how the first rave in Moscow became sponsored by a seafood company. To promote their business, they'd sell fish sandwiches. But before the team could begin promoting the event, they needed a name.
Музыка, которая нас вдохновляет, культура, которая нас вдохновляет, люди, которые нас вдохновляют, то есть которые являются нашими друзьями. Это люди из космоса, это музыка космическая, это культура космическая.
Space has long been a theme tied to psychedelic and electronic music. But what made it especially palpable in this time and place was the Soviet Union's long history of using space travel in propaganda.
Почему именно этот символ, а не какой-то другой космонавт, скажем?
Потому что Гагарин первый. Нас же интересует только первые.
Yuri Gagarin was the first human to enter space. He was a folk hero in Russia who died tragically young. To be now using his image in the service of a drug-fueled dance party was highly ironic, perhaps even offensive. But there was genuine affection for Yuri and the utopian scientific curiosity he represented. These flyers were printed and distributed around Moscow, though nobody really knew what they were being invited to. According to Mixmag Russia, beermen would pass them out at the newly opened McDonald's, because, unironically, it was where you could find the rich, fashionable, and trendy. Big Macs weren't cheap. When the night finally came, it was an odd blend to approach the gates. Kids dressed in wild, space-themed outfits, alongside fur-clad fashionistas and men in business attire. It is difficult to convey just what they would have seen when they entered the pavilion. A ceiling over 200 feet, 75 meters tall, with a mountain of strobe lights and lasers that reflected off the spacecraft hanging above. There was a wall of TV monitors showing old newsreels of space expeditions, a display of paintings by Timur Novikov. As Andrei Haas wrote in his biography, Happiness Corporation, everyone who found themselves in the roaring and brightly lit pavilion for the first time that day behaved the same way, literally opening their mouths. People looked around wildly and winced from the thunderous sound. Like a growing river, emboldened guests flowed down the aisle, and within a few minutes, the bravest ones found themselves on the dance floor. Music was playing from the moment they set up the sound system, but the first DJ to take the stage, as Andre remembers, was Joachim, who came all the way from France. A difficult journey that required him to use fake papers and remain dead silent in transit to avoid revealing his accent. He announced his presence with Brazil, a techno track with a simple, alluring melody, perfect to build the tension of what was coming. For the next 90 minutes, he played mostly Belgian and British techno and house. We know this because, amazingly, the mixtape of his performance still exists. The music he played was new, unheard of by anyone, Andre wrote, and he played it furiously, quickly turning over records that were still smoking from scratches. But what Andre remembered more than anything was the moment he played What Time Is Love by the KLF. Next up was Jānis Krauklis from Latvia, who is typically given the honor of the USSR's first vinyl DJ. His repertoire included tracks of the acid variety, as well as several from the German artist WestBam. Following Jānis were three more DJs from Latvia, including Robert Gobzinch, who went by the name EastBam. In addition to spinning tracks, he was also a songwriter and rapper. And while I'm not sure if he rapped at this event specifically, I'd like to think that Moscow residents that night were gifted with his flow. It can't be understated just how new of an experience this would have been for the roughly 3,000 attendees. Prior to this, the only raves that took place were considerably calmer events, hosted by the Communist Youth Party, or underground shows like the ones at Fontanka. While many in the professional class started that night sipping beers and nibbling fish sandwiches, frightened by what was happening on the dance floor, they gradually let their guard down. As Andre described, the scene was one of laughter, exclamations, mouths open in bewilderment, waving of arms, pinching of ears, whistling, running around and dancing clumsily. All of this happened to people who did not expect such a grinding of their brains in this cosmic meat grinder. And it was this element of surprise that gave the night an almost spiritual quality. As the artist Sergei Bugayev put it, even the ancient Greeks performed rituals and mysteries where sound played a key role. Without an excursion into ancient history, it is impossible to understand what happened here. Of course, memories of mysteries and religious rituals were erased from everyday life, especially in the Soviet times. That's why many people perceived it as something very strange, as if an alien spaceship had actually landed. The spiritual element was further enhanced by the flow of psychedelics through the audience. While Andrei never discusses such details in his book, the Soviet historian Alexei Yorchak claims that drugs ranging from acid to PCP were introduced to many people that night. In particular, hallucinogenic mushrooms that grew in the forests outside St. Petersburg. The otherworldly vibes hit a peak around 4 a.m. when the group New Composers hit the stage. This band, hailing from St. Petersburg, performed live with keyboards and a drum machine. Their repertoire included the anthemic Tanz, Tanzevat, as well as their song, The Sputnik of Life. At around 5 a.m., another surprise was in store. People in the bars started jumping up and waving their hands, Andrei wrote. A cameraman came forth, and the person he was filming appeared on a huge video screen. Cosmonaut, the crowd cheered with excitement. And sure enough, then 60-year-old cosmonaut Georgy Grechka was walking down the aisle, smiling and saluting. Let me repeat that. This respected space traveler agreed to show up at 5 a.m. when the party was no doubt in its delirious stage. And he had a blast. His appearance injected another dose of adrenaline and dopamine into the crowd as they proceeded to dance even harder. As the night wound down, the organizers felt a deep satisfaction. After all their hard work and all the challenges they had to overcome, here were 3,000 people spiritually transformed. Here was one of the great men from their childhood, saluting them, validating them, passing the torch, so to speak. Not to mention 2 other cosmonauts who made the trip.
Какие могут быть перспективы? Вы знаете, что конец века.
Очень оптимистично.
Вот наши перспективы. Мы радуемся, мы встречаем конец века, мы должны понять, что скоро близится действительно светлое царство.
But that bright kingdom would never arrive. 12 days after this party, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. 5 days later, price controls were lifted, setting off massive inflation. The privatization of government industries led to a handful of oligarchs getting filthy rich, while many factories ceased functioning, and families had to literally barter goods to get by. Average caloric intake dropped some 20%. Life expectancy fell 8 years. Criminal gangs were emboldened. Assassinations were frequent. And meanwhile, the government's brief window of democracy was shifting back to authoritarianism. The main elements of the Gagarin Party could be viewed as a microcosm for this decline. There's the space pavilion itself, which becomes something of a shopping mall and car lot before falling out of use and into disrepair. Then there's the matter of raves and rave culture, which would explode in popularity but lose much of its artistic basis. Huge clubs would open up in Moscow that were embedded with organized crime. Ivan Salmaksov, one of the 4 organizers, continued putting on events until he disappeared in 1998 and was presumed murdered by rival promoters. By the end of the decade, one could look back and see the Gagarin Party as something of a turning point, as the very moment the mythologies that once upheld the Soviet Union, the symbols of progress and scientific achievement, were quite literally trampled on, replaced by the empty values of indulgence and greed. But this is obviously a rather shallow reading of what the Gagarin Party was actually about. As Sergei Bagayev put it, it was the equivalence of a religious ritual for a modern techno-civilization. A brief glimpse of utopia, only possible in these scant few years, when old powers had broken down, but new ones had yet to replace them. Where conversations could unfold with no topic off limits, where fashion was an expression of shabby creativity, where cops and criminals alike could be kept at bay with only a modest wad of rubles. It didn't last for long. No pioneering music scene does. But during that brief window, it sure looked like a blast.